at public investment in the post-pandemic economy. I'm joined by Paolo Mauro, who is the Deputy Director of the IMF's Fiscal Affairs Department. Paolo, let's jump right into this. Tell us about kind of how the IMF is thinking about the different phases of this economic period of the pandemic and the immediate period after the pandemic, and what the focus is of this chapter.
Thank you, Josh. So the Fiscal Monitor analyzes public investment as part of the fiscal strategy for the economic recovery. And if we look around the world today, we see that governments are taking unprecedented fiscal measures to support people and firms, especially in the initial phase of the pandemic, which involves lockdowns. So this is the time when people and firms really need those unemployment benefits and transfers in order to survive, literally. And as the lockdowns are eased tentatively, this is the phase when governments can now start to think about and implement measures that will support the economic recovery and, most importantly, create jobs, because a lot of people have become unemployed. So we see public investment as being a very effective way of generating activity and jobs at this time. It can do so quickly and efficiently. And then we can also start the plans for the post-pandemic economy, which hopefully will be more green, more digital, and more inclusive. So we do think about the policies for these three different phases, and public investment can play a crucial role in this macroeconomic environment. In fact, we estimate that if you increase public investment as a share of GDP by 1%, over the next 2 years, that creates 2% more GDP and increases employment by 1%. So a 1% of GDP increase in public investment, for example, in the European Union, would create as many as 2 to 3 million jobs. The number for the United States would be almost 2 million jobs. So public investment in this current macroeconomic environment has a very powerful impact on job creation and economic activity. It also brings in private investment, which at this time is extremely low. From a macroeconomic perspective, public investment is appropriate because interest rates, the cost of borrowing for governments, is extremely low right now. Even prior to the pandemic, nominal interest rates in the main advanced economies were in some cases even negative. And now we are in this unprecedented situation of very low cost of borrowing, crumbling infrastructure, frankly speaking, even in the advanced economies, large amounts of unemployed resources. So public investment can now provide that support to economic activity and job creation that is needed. The situation differs a little bit depending on the type of country, so I'm happy to elaborate on that and also on how we get to the estimates that I mentioned.
Well, actually, let me first ask how you envision public investment being different in this post-pandemic period compared to what it was over the past 10 years. You mentioned a little bit some areas, priority areas of fixing crumbling infrastructure and investing in a greener, more sustainable future. But what's kind of the encouragement that you're giving to countries in terms of where they ought to focus their public investments in this period that may be different than it was in the past?
Right, and it does depend, indeed, it does depend on the phase of the pandemic cycle, if you will. So right now, when we need to create jobs, essentially immediately, we need to focus on that and have results right away. We recommend that countries undertake investment in maintenance. So again, we do have a lot of opportunities for valuable maintenance investment, not just in poor countries, but also, in fact, even more in the advanced economies. I'll give you a couple of examples. In France, 1/4 of the potable water pipes have reached the age when they need to be replaced. And in the United States, the average age of a bridge is 45 years right now. And we know from engineers that the typical lifespan of a bridge is 50 years. So there's a lot of maintenance work that would have needed to be done even aside from the pandemic. And maintenance investment is very labor intensive. It creates a lot of jobs and it can be activated very quickly. So that's the immediate priority. But then when we come to further investment plans, first we need to look at the ones that maybe are stalled or not quite completed, so we can give a push to those. And we also can look at those that are in the pipeline for the next couple of years. But coming back to your question about the new priorities, as we plan, and we should plan right now for the post-pandemic world, the priorities should be for projects that are green, that are digital, because we've seen in this pandemic how important it is for everybody to have access to digital. So digital infrastructure, electricity for countries where not everybody has access to it. Those are real priorities going forward. So then on top of that, for countries that need to meet the sustainable development goals, so countries that are more in the low income spectrum, for those priorities are very much similar to what was the case prior to the crisis. So clean water and sanitation, electrification, all of those remain important priorities. And those countries right now need the support from the global community to be able to finance those kinds of investments. Because as I alluded to earlier, it's easy for some of the largest advanced economies right now to borrow on international capital markets, but that's not the case for low-income countries.
I actually want to ask a question about the economics that I had planned to ask. Is there a sense that right now is an especially good time to do this when you have large numbers of underutilized resources, you have factories that have been idled, you have large numbers of unemployed people that are really eager to work? Is there kind of a win-win moment that we have right here where these investments are even better? You know, it's always important to upgrade, crumbling bridges, but is this an especially important moment to take advantage of it and do it now? Do it in the next couple of years when we're in that immediate post-pandemic phase?
Yes, indeed. And by the way, we're not yet in the post-pandemic phase. We're still in the pandemic phase right now. But definitely, we are in, different countries are at different stages. Some are still in lockdown or in partial lockdown. Some are opening tentatively. We're not yet at the stage of really calling it post-pandemic. But nevertheless, what you mentioned is absolutely right. Even prior to the pandemic, the cost of borrowing in advanced economies was extremely low, and that signaled that there was excess savings available. Private investment was low, and therefore, even at that stage already, we were making the case for more public investment. Now the case is even stronger because on top of what I just mentioned, we have a lot of people who are looking for jobs, and private investment has fallen even further. So when we tried in our estimates, I want to unpack a little bit how we got to our estimates. We thought very hard about two aspects in particular. The first is extreme uncertainty. Right now, there's a lot of uncertainty about the future path of the pandemic and the future path of the economy. And that's something which is causing private entrepreneurs to kind of wait to see what's going to happen. And that's really having a detrimental effect on private investment. So in our estimates, of course, this is a crisis like no other. So in some ways, you could say, well, estimates that are based on past data may not be that informative for the special situation in which we find ourselves. But we use data for many years and more than 70 countries. And we made sure to include a measure of uncertainty in our estimates. And what's that giving us is that we find that uncertainty makes it even more important for there to be public investment, because in times of uncertainty, private investment is very depressed. People are looking for some reassurance, and they're looking for some new opportunities, in the middle of a very depressed situation. So this is a time when public investment provides the most bang for the buck, if you will, for private investment. The other thing that we wanted to explore was the role of indebtedness of firms. And we used data for 400,000 firms around the world. And we tracked which ones of those were already highly indebted and which ones were not. And what we find is that the impact of public investment is greater on the private investment by those firms that are not overly indebted. Those that are already highly indebted don't really have opportunities to invest a lot more. So the policy implication, which we outline in the report, is that doing public investment, of course, is helpful, but it's going to be even more helpful if we are careful to have an institutional framework that allows the quick resolution of firms that may have to go through bankruptcy. And so the resolution of those firms that are overly indebted is something that needs to be looked at very quickly, because then we have a situation in which public investment can be even more effective.
You mentioned that the world's countries are in very different circumstances right now. Obviously, we have advanced economies that have tremendous capacity to borrow, even given where their debt burdens already are. But we have emerging markets and developing economies that are already, kind of up against very difficult fiscal restraints and need to be thinking about fiscal discipline at the same time as they're pursuing these public investments. They're relying on external debt markets in a way that some of the advanced economies are. What is the advice to those countries on how to balance the public investment that you argue is urgently needed with the reality of those constraints they face borrowing any more than they already have?
Indeed, the situation is very different. So in the advanced economies, as you mentioned, it's relatively easy to access financing at low interest rates. But for most low-income countries and some emerging economies, access to global financial markets at the moment is not an option. And even borrowing domestically is somewhat limited. So for those countries, policymakers are having to make very tough choices, and they need to support their people. They need to spend more on healthcare. And what we're observing in some cases is that they're having to cut back on investment. And of course, these are countries that need a lot of investment for economic development, for meeting the sustainable development goals. So it's very important in those countries to make sure that the investment projects they undertake are as efficient as possible. And the group of colleagues in the Fiscal Affairs Department have just published a book by the title Well Spent. That book goes into the details of infrastructure governance. The analysis shows that with proper public investment management, one can improve the efficiency of public investment projects by as much as 1/3. And so that's something that countries can do on their own to ensure that they get the most bang for the buck for their investment projects. That also means that the international community needs to support those countries through grants and through concessional financing.
Thank you so much for joining us today for this discussion of the analytical chapter of the IMF's Fiscal Monitor. public investment in the recovery. I hope those of you following along at home have been safe and healthy during this period and will continue to be that way until we finally reach the post-pandemic phase. Thank you so much for being here with us today.